I'm Joel Brondos, one of the pastors and the headmaster at Zion Lutheran Church and Academy in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and been doing that for about 5 years now. The deep key theological questions that children face at an early age, I think, is this: what do you want to be when you grow up? Some of you may still be trying to answer that question, but at some point when you've taken a twig or a used popsicle stick and thrown it into a rain-water swelled ditch, you watch it run along and it goes to the culvert and you run over to the other side to see it come out. Or when you take those dirt clods and throwing them up in the air, making all kinds of sound effects and watching them explode in a cloud of dust, you realize, I can't do this for the rest of my life. I'm going to have to do something else when I grow up. And if I can't play in ditches or with dirt clods, what is it that I'm going to do? The question may therefore arise out of a child's own experience, or it may come from Uncle John or Aunt Mary or Mom or Dad. What do you want to be when you grow up? And as children are young, their answers may be very cute and interesting. What are they thinking about at that age? Many times they want to be something like a baseball player or a basketball player. It's a significant point at which one can begin to make a distinction between classical education and a progressive education. When the question is asked, I think it's important to note how it is answered. Quite often, the answer will come back in terms of a vocation. I want to be a fireman. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a ball player. I want to be a rock star. What a surprise it would be if the answer came back to virtue. What do you want to be when you grow up? Faithful. Dad, when I grow up, I want to be honest. I want to be wise. Quite often today, people identify themselves with their vocation, with what they do. I'm a dentist. I'm a newspaper reporter. And that can cause problems in people's lives, problems that pastors often deal with. If for some reason, either because of health or because of downsizing or whatever, they can't do what they've been doing all along. They can't do what they've been trained for, and they have an identity crisis. It's not just a matter of paying the bills. If I can't be an auto car salesman anymore, what am I going to do? Who am I? If I can't do such and such, what am I going to be? What's the meaning of life? We all know how often people change jobs nowadays. Are they also having to change identity? What is the meaning of life? So classical education, perhaps at its root, is really talking about something more than just making people fit for a job, for a vocation, for getting a salary, and putting a roof over their heads, or putting food in their stomach, but to understand what it means to be truly human. And so when we address the question that way, we want to ask, will the curriculum look any different? I just kind of put this up here for a screen test. And Joel Kirshen did a great job. Thank you very much for saying everything that I was going to say. But just as a quick review, and maybe you can add to this, and I'll be appreciative of your criticism too, of some of the distinctions between classical education and progressive education. First of all, classical education tends to be encyclopedic. Some people will say it's general knowledge, and I find that word general just a little bit too bland, I suppose. Quintilian, I think, was the first to talk about education being encyclopedic, from which we get the word circle, and kyklos, and paideia, education. It's where we get the idea of a well-rounded education. They're not just being given a bunch of facts and subject matter and somehow stuff them all inside of your head, but it comes together in a way that is structured and organized. And you have a well-rounded view and a broad perspective of many things as you're getting that foundation and establishment for education, understanding what it means to be human. Whereas progressive may tend to be a little bit more towards the vocational, the school-to-work philosophy. Businesses are very much concerned nowadays with getting good workers. It's hard to find people who can write a letter well and or even count back change, those kinds of things. And perhaps some of them think that the solution is to just start with children at a very young age, training them to do certain jobs, and then when they get in the workplace, they'll be able to do those jobs. That in one sense may make parents or even teachers more of kind of a business agent or a trainer rather than an educator, understanding what life's all about and facing life's questions. Secondly, classical tends to be more content-based. Subject matter is important, whereas progressive is a little bit more wants to be skills-based. So, for example, with regard to reading, progressive education wants children to read well. And there are several debates going on about how to get children to read well, but classical education is not satisfied with just having children read well. We also want them to be well-read. We don't just want our children to read well, we want them to be well-read. We want the content of what they are reading to be good, meaty stuff. So at Zion, we've been developing our own literature-based curriculum so that children are reading the best literature out there to give them a perspective of what it means to be human, to be a child of God in His kingdom, His earthly kingdom, as we look forward to the life which is to come. But also giving them that just a broad perspective of life. Classical is interested in objective truth, whereas in the progressive, a constructed truth is the thing. Children construct their own reality. And so it's not a matter of just telling them what the facts are. The children have to find out the facts on their own, and they may not always necessarily be the same kind of facts that you have in mind. The idea is to let them go ahead and create their own realities. Direct instruction, the classical, imparting of information, but and we'll get to this in just a moment too, some of the false dichotomies that are put out there as well. As opposed to discovery learning or hands-on learning where the children are just kind of finding things out for themselves. Another important topic that I'd love to spend a lot more time on is the distinction between leisure. Joseph Pieper has written a fantastic book on leisure, the basis of culture. What it is that we do with our free time, if you will, with our life. That classical education, in my mind, is what we would be doing if we were still in the Garden of Eden. Discovering and enjoying and delighting in all the magnificence of God's creation, how it works, how it all fits together. And so we do these things out of a kind of a pleasure. It's a different kind of pleasure than being a couch potato, I suppose. Whereas it seems to me the progressive education, or the goal, once somebody has been trained up and they're out in the workforce, is just kind of a, thank God it's Friday, I can crash in front of the TV set or whatever. There's a whole different perspective on understanding of leisure. And then finally a distinctive, perhaps, the individual character as opposed to social reform. And I think there are a lot of other elements that play into this. Some of these advocates of progressive education aren't necessarily so concerned about education as they are economics. What is it that's going to produce children who can create things in the marketplace? They can produce a product, and that they can also be good consumers. So I think there's a lot of that kind of thing also influencing education today. It has been for the last 100 years or so. Some of the false dichotomies between classical education and progressive education, and we saw some of these just a moment ago, but some people say, well, the classical education is subject-oriented and the progressive is child-centered. That's not really true. We are looking forward to conveying subject matter to children in a way that they will enjoy. There are different kinds of fun available to children today. We can entertain them and have them have fun that way, but there's also a kind of fun when a child all of a sudden realizes and understands something that she never understood before in a profound way. That's fun. It hasn't come about through entertainment. It has come about probably through some hard work. And that's what we want to be able to provide for our children. So we are interested in the subject, but not at the expense of somehow having that to be more important than the children themselves. Secondly, passive learning and active learning. If you were at Andrew Kern's lecture yesterday, you understand how we teach children to be active listeners, for example. They aren't, just because the teacher is doing the lecturing, that doesn't mean that the students are passive by any means. They're forming questions in their minds. They are not just taking notes, but figuring out how the different facts will assimilate one with another, how they might be applied, how they will be used. So it's not by any means just purely passive learning. Thirdly, rote memorization versus a kind of a critical thinking. Here, the emphasis really is on the data itself. Classical education isn't just interested in stuffing facts into have children's minds so they can regurgitate it over a short period of time. Rote memorization has many better values than just doing that, which was recognized in the ancient world, too. If you can't remember something, you haven't learned it. Memory is a very important part of education. Whereas critical thinking again, sort of an emphasis on skills-based instruction, isn't really concerned with the content. You want to teach children how to think critically, but the content isn't terribly important. Richard Paul, I think, addresses this concern very well in emphasizing that you can't have critical thinking without the content. So it may be attempting to teach critical thinking as a skill, but without the data that you might get through some rote memorization. The great ideas of the Western world versus practical life skills. Again, it's as though children aren't going to be able to write out their own checks or something if they get a classical education. That's not very practical. Far from it. I think classical education is very practical as we deal with one another as human beings, to understand what people are going through as we study history, as we study literature. I think, again, it was Andrew who mentioned once that we learn a lot about romance through Shakespeare, learn about love through literature rather than some other kind of experience, just letting children do those sort of things. And then finally, individual study versus cooperative learning. There's cooperative learning that also goes on in classical education. Emphasis in progressive education is just have everybody kind of work together and solve something out themselves, see what they come up with. But it's not an isolationist kind of thing that's going on in classical education either. I just want to address a couple of things too, I suppose, to show how this is affecting us in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, also in terms of its theology and what is being taught. Let's see, just the one. I've got a lot more slides up here to show than we have time for, so I apologize for trying to think on my feet a little bit. But here is one of the math textbooks that's being used in one of our Concordias, where it says, there are some areas in which teachers should explicitly remove themselves from a position of authority, one of which is deciding whether answers are correct. In traditional systems of instruction, teachers are asked to provide feedback on students' responses to tell them whether or not they are right. In the system we are describing, this is almost always unnecessary and usually inappropriate. Mathematics is a unique subject because there is often only one right answer, and because correctness is not a matter of opinion. It is built into the logic and structure of the subject. In other words, everyone will agree on the right answer to a problem if they understand the problem and think about it long enough. Part of what it means to understand mathematics is to understand the problem and the method used to solve it. When this happens, the solver knows whether the answer is correct. There's no need for the teacher to have the final word on correctness. The final word is provided by the logic of the subject and the student's explanations and justifications that are built on this logic. So I know that some of the teachers at our Concordias are taught not to teach the details of mathematics, what's a numerator and denominator, but just to try to lead children to discover these things for themselves. This is even making its way into some of our theological publications. Concordia Journal, we read a sermon study by Robert Hughes, which says, in summary, we have said that at their best, sermons shaped like questions enable preachers and listeners together to think about the interaction of faith and life. Getting the right answer is not the point, especially if that means the preacher's right answer. We are seeking to develop mature Christians with inquiring minds, believers able to do their own theological reflection. So here's an example of how the progressive way of thinking is even affecting the writing of sermons. We don't really want to tell people what's right. We want to put questions into their heads and let them do their own theological reflection. It's not a matter anymore of conveying the truth or speaking the truth in love. It's more giving people questions to think about so they can do their own theological reflections. Here's one other example of some of the modern research. I forget where this is from. This is from Tips for the Mathematics Teacher, Research-Based Strategies to Help Students Learn. Mistakes are desirable. Most teachers consider mistakes as something forbidden. They immediately correct mistakes in the text, on the blackboard, on posters, and exercise books, and in every student's answer. Prohibiting mistakes produces anxiety about making mistakes, and accordingly students become inhibited. This attitude toward mistakes easily can become a heavy burden, especially when there is time pressure. It can also cause students to stop using traditional tools such as a calculator. I think rather than just trying to beat up on the progressive method of education, I think it's a concern to us all, whether you're homeschooling or teaching in a school or you have no intentions of teaching the progressive method, because we are going to be living, and we are living in a society of children who have been raised this way, and in a very caring way, and perhaps in a way that which we want to be. That is not the best word that I'm looking for, but to interact with people who have gone through these things, we need to understand that. Some of us who are trained to know the proper way to make an argument, to discuss things rationally, to raise questions, won't be able to do that with people who haven't been trained how to do that. And I think it's going to be a great challenge for us to learn not just how to think critically, but also how to respond to people who have been raised progressively. Now, as a positive way of trying to address some of these things, I think it's very important for you to read a couple of other heroes. The books that Mr. Kirshen mentioned are great. And it looks like I've got a couple more things to read very shortly. But you've got to read Luther's letter to the nobility in Germany for the maintaining and establishing of Christian schools. I scanned in the text of that's on the table out there, I think for just $1 or something, because I took a translation that was printed before 1900 because there aren't any copyright concerns about that. But that's one thing you need to read. You can also get it in Luther's works. The other thing is Luther's sermon on keeping children in school. You'll see a very different understanding of education that you've been hearing quite frequently, but also understanding of elements of education which are vital for us to live together, to provide leaders in our society who will serve society. Luther's emphasis and goal of education is not that we would somehow praise and glorify God, but that we would serve our neighbor in love. That's one of his main goals. We're not just learning education, again, as he puts it, to put a roof over our head or keep our bellies full, but to serve others in a loving way. So part of that is learning how to be wise and honest. Stanley Bonner, in his book on education in ancient Rome, emphasizes that to be bene educatus, to be, we would maybe say, well educated, wasn't emphasizing intellectual development of the children as it was to develop their overall character, to be good workers, to be good neighbors, to be industrious, and to have the intellectual side of it as well, as they understood what leisure was. So all of those things are part. So reading Luther's letter to the nobility in Germany that they maintain and establish Christian schools, also his sermon on keeping children in school, you really need to read, if you hopefully already know the small catechism, read the large catechism, and also the prefaces to both of those catechisms. Very, very important, understanding why Luther is educating and how he is doing it. Okay, and what I found very, very interesting here lately in the development of education, both in the very soon I'm getting sort of a second education on my own, going back and having read Luther, and then also studying some the elements of Johannes Bugenhagen, who was reestablishing schools at the time of the Reformation, and Johann Sturm, to find some just real gems and treasures in their works. So we can share some of those too when we have a little bit more time. And I think what I probably would like to do now, I could, some of the other things I had hoped to do was actually go through the curriculum and speak directly and specifically about some of the subjects and how they are taught in a classical way at Zion. But perhaps in 5 or 7 minutes, I'd like to have some questions or something. And if you don't have any, then I'll just go ahead and proceed with some of those specific subjects. Yes? Yes, Louis Spitz had written a pretty monumental work. It's available through Concordia Publishing House. It's great to see those kind of things being published. And then also, I had just come across a doctoral dissertation. There's very little that you can find on Bugenhagen that's been translated, about a doctoral dissertation by Kurt Hendel, H-E-N-D-E-L. I just contacted him last week as well. He was teaching in Chicago at LSTC, and his dissertation here on Bugenhagen's educational contributions. And what he does is go back and specifically look at the curriculum, the amount of time spent for each subject, and what kind of, at what age levels children were doing these things. Bugenhagen? Oh, Hendel. No, Hendel is. He said he used to be in the Missouri Synod. I think he's in the ELCA now. He's at LSTC. I don't know too much more about him. He apologized. He said I would want to talk to him if he was in the ELCA. And I said, happy to speak to him. Gordon. I'm not really sure. Do you know, Barry? Was it the senior or junior Spitz that wrote the Sturm book on education? Senior. Anybody else? Andrew? About not worrying about making mistakes? Well, it's difficult to some degree too. I was going to quote from Diane Ravitch, just like Joel Kirshen did. I don't know if I still have that up here or not. She says it's very difficult to make a distinction. In her book, Left Bad, it is difficult in many respects to make a cut and dried distinction between traditional education that she addresses and progressive education, because they run a full gamut, and all of these things, the kind of things you're talking about, even about making mistakes. I think in that particular situation, it seems to me that some of the radical progressivists are saying don't worry about making a mistake because there isn't anything that's necessarily true. Whereas in classical education, we say, well, you make mistakes, this is the place to do it. Feel comfortable in making mistakes here so that you don't keep on making them, and then you grow and learn from them. That's what I take as being the difference. Well, I think my concern with that quote is that we're just asking questions. That the proclamation of the word in the sermons is asking questions and not just a proclamation of the truth. Yes, and not in the sense of any objective truth. Here it is. Let's take a look at it. Absolutely. You said a question and answer. Here, for him, getting the right answer is not the point. The main thing is asking the question. It depends on what somebody means by doing their own theological reflection. That's not, you can't do that apart from content. I mean, it's not an introspective, just thinking and feeling what I want to, but it's always addressing the content of Scripture, for example. Okay. So, for example, in our religion studies, Bible and catechesis, we want to have a knowledge of the Bible. They get the data of the books of the Bible. They can spell the books of the Bible and put them in order, and they know a little something about each book of the Bible. But we're moving towards something as we do that. It's a distinct intention for us to be able to have our children use the Bible to address the problems and concerns of today. And how is it that children, the most difficult books in the Bible, I don't know if you would consider that to be the prophetic books or even the epistles, because they're dealing with more abstract vocabulary, for example. How do we move from the narratives to the epistles in the Bible? The classical education wants to have a distinct method and a track for doing that, so they can not just leave big gaps in their study of the Scriptures for the future, and they also need to learn how to use the tools for Bible study so they can do these things on their own. Progressive education talks about lifelong learners too, but I think it's in a different way than we talk about in classical education. That's something we can perhaps discuss over lunch. Music is something that we don't just teach for the sake of teaching music. It's its own purpose, but music is used to convey the data in many respects. We sing the faith. It stays in our hearts and minds in a clearer way. It's easier to sing things into our memory sometimes than to just recite them. The Shirley Grammar method will use little jingles and things, even songs, to get the facts to stay in children's minds. But music is much more than just some kind of a hobby that is taught for children. So they receive kind of instruction that trains their ears and disciplines their minds as well. Emphasis more on history and civics and geography than on social studies. We're not, again, primarily interested in the economics of the world, but how people have, through the course of time, related to one another, and what does the geography have to do with the way that people have related to one another. So we give children a structure on which they can hang things. Beginning in first grade, they're learning about 5 different dates per week. And of course, times they learn about 80 on our timeline. And then as they grow through the various grades, they start to flush those things out. And they have a structure. So there's a very big emphasis on organized knowledge. And you can have a school full of good teachers, but if they're not directly aware of what's going on before and what's going on after, there isn't a continuity of learning growing from learning. Knowledge builds on knowledge, and so we want to have that working through the curriculum that way. Okay? Well, thanks. Again, it was hard to follow on Joel's great presentation, and taking up and have a lot of other great anecdotes to share sometime with you all. Hopefully we can continue this conversation on during lunch and at other times. Thank you very much.